Hey guys, tonight we are diving deep into one of history's most bizarre and unsettling episodes, the peculiar case of the dancing plague of 1518. Picture this: a hot summer day, the sun beating down relentlessly, and in the middle of a bustling city street, a woman starts to dance. And she doesn't stop. Not for hours, not for days. Soon, others join her, their bodies flailing, caught in a compulsive, seemingly endless ballet of exhaustion and despair. It's a scene that defies easy explanation, a historical mystery that continues to fascinate and confound. Frankly, if you found yourself in her shoes, or more accurately, her probably very uncomfortable 16th century peasant clogs, you probably wouldn't survive the week, let alone the month-long dance marathon some endured. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It really helps the channel and ensures you won't miss out on future historical rabbit holes. And while you're at it, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Drop a comment below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself stepping, not onto your familiar bedroom floor, but onto the rough, uneven cobblestones of Strasbourg in the Alsace region, then a free imperial city of the Holy Roman Empire. The year is 1518. It's July, and the air is thick, heavy with the kind of summer heat that clings to you, a damp, oppressive blanket. The sun, a molten gold disk in the hazy sky, beats down with an almost personal vengeance. Buildings lean in towards each other, their timber frames casting narrow, insufficient strips of shade. The streets are alive, a cacophony of sounds and smells that are a world away from your own. You hear the clatter of wooden cartwheels, the shouts of vendors hawking their wares, fresh bread from a nearby bakery, dubious-looking cuts of meat, perhaps even some of those fashionable new printed pamphlets that are all the rage. The aroma, well, let's just say personal hygiene and waste disposal aren't quite up to modern standards. It's a potent cocktail of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, animal dung, and the faint, sweetish scent of tanneries from down by the River Ill. You might want to hold your breath, but honestly, you'd get used to it, or pass out. One of the two. Amidst this vibrant, if somewhat fragrant, tapestry of medieval life, something unusual is about to unfold. Your attention is drawn to a narrow street, perhaps near the city's magnificent cathedral, its spire piercing the sky. There, in a small, sun-drenched clearing, a woman stands. Her name, as history would record it, is Frau Trophäa. She's not a noblewoman, dressed in silks and velvets. She's an ordinary citizen, her clothes practical, perhaps a little worn. There's nothing initially remarkable about her. Another face in the bustling crowd. Then she begins to move. It's not a joyful jig, not a graceful pirouette. Her movements are jerky, uncoordinated. Her arms flail, her legs kick out, her body twists and turns with a strange, compulsive energy. There's no music, save for the ambient noise of the city and the rhythmic slap of her worn leather shoes, or perhaps she's even barefoot, on the dusty ground. Imagine the scene. One moment, she's just standing there, perhaps looking a little distressed or agitated. And the next, she's launched into this bizarre, solitary performance. Her face is flushed, beaded with sweat, her expression hard to read. Is it pain? Ecstasy? Or simple, unadulterated madness? Passers-by stop and stare. At first, perhaps there's amusement. A woman making a spectacle of herself. A bit of unexpected street theatre. Children might point and giggle. Shopkeepers might lean out of their doorways, curiosity piqued. But as minutes stretch into an hour, and then another, the amusement likely fades, replaced by a growing sense of unease. Frau Trophäa doesn't stop. She doesn't acknowledge the onlookers. She just dances. Her breathing becomes ragged, her movements more desperate. Yet she continues, as if driven by some invisible force. Her neighbours, who know her as a wife and mother, a part of their community, would surely try to intervene. "Frau Trophäa, what troubles you?" they might ask, reaching out a hand. But she doesn't respond, or perhaps she pushes them away, her focus entirely on this relentless, self-inflicted torment. This isn't some whimsical, fleeting moment. Historians confirm that she danced, almost without pause, for somewhere between 4 and 6 days. Imagine the physical toll. No water, no food, no rest. The sun blazing down, the dust choking her, her muscles screaming in protest. It's a feat of endurance that borders on the superhuman, or perhaps the deeply pathological. This wasn't a quick flash mob that disperses after a catchy tune. This was an ordeal. You try dancing for 6 minutes straight without your Spotify, playlist cutting out, let alone 6 days. The very public nature of this event in a city like Strasbourg is significant. It wasn't some isolated village. Strasbourg was a prominent, bustling city, a hub of commerce and intellectual life, particularly with the recent advent of the printing press. News, and indeed strange behavior, would travel fast. Historians still argue whether Frau Trophäa's initial motivation was rooted in personal distress, religious fervor, or some unknown physical ailment. But what is undeniable is the effect she had. She was the spark. Think about the common footwear of the time for a person of her standing. She likely wore simple turn shoes, made of leather, often with thin soles, or perhaps rough wooden-soled clogs if the ground was particularly muddy. Neither would offer much comfort or support for an hours-long, days-long, frenzied dance on hard cobblestones. Blisters would form, burst, and bleed. Her feet would be raw, her ankles swollen. Yet, she danced on. This detail often gets lost, the sheer, physical agony that must have accompanied the spectacle. It's one thing to imagine the bizarre nature of the dance, another to consider the brutal reality of what it was doing to her body. As the first day bleeds into the second, and then the third, the initial curiosity of the onlookers must have morphed into something else. Concern, certainly, but also, perhaps, a dawning fear. In an age where the lines between the natural and supernatural were blurred, where divine punishment and demonic possession were considered very real possibilities, such an inexplicable event would have been deeply unsettling. What did it mean? Was it a sign, a curse, or was Frau Trophäa simply, tragically, losing her mind in the most public way imaginable? Her solitary, desperate dance, under the oppressive July sun, was just the beginning. The silence from her, the lack of explanation, only amplified the strangeness, the unearthly quality of her unceasing motion. The city watched and waited and wondered what on earth was going on. You're still there, in the sweltering heat of Strasbourg. The image of Frau Trophäa's relentless, solitary dance seared into your mind. Days have passed since she first began her disturbing performance, and the initial shock among her neighbors and the wider community has begun to curdle into a potent brew of fear and profound confusion. She hasn't stopped. Her body, you can only imagine, must be a screaming wreck of exhaustion and pain. Yet some unseen puppet master keeps pulling her strings. The dust raised by her tormented feet settles, only to be kicked up again with each jerky, convulsive movement. Then, the truly terrifying thing happens. It's no longer just Frau Trophäa. Perhaps it starts subtly. A young man, idly watching from the edge of the small crowd that now perpetually surrounds her, begins to tap his foot, not in time with any music, because there still isn't any, unless you count the ragged, gasping breaths of Frau Trophäa as some kind of avant-garde rhythm section. His foot tapping becomes more insistent. His leg begins to jerk. Then his other leg. Soon, he too is lurching into the open space, his limbs flailing with the same desperate, uncoordinated energy that possesses the first dancer. There's no shared glance, no acknowledgement. It's as if he's been infected by her movement, the visual cue flipping a switch deep within his own mind. Or maybe it's a woman from a nearby market stall who, after days of witnessing the spectacle, suddenly drops her basket of wilting vegetables, her eyes glazing over, and stumbles into her own frantic jig. One by one, like a horrifying slow-motion chain reaction, others join. Another man, then a teenage girl, then an older woman, their faces contorted in expressions that mirror Frau Troffea's own ambiguous torment. There's no rhyme or reason to who succumbs next. It's not like they're lining up for the latest TikTok dance challenge. This is far more sinister, far more chaotic. Within about a week of Frau Troffea's initial inexplicable performance, historical records suggest that over 30 other individuals had joined her, 30 people, thrashing, spinning, leaping, their bodies seemingly beyond their own control. The small clearing where Frau Troffea began her ordeal is no longer sufficient. The dancing spills out, a bizarre, unwelcome tide, into the wider street. You see them now, not as a single, isolated curiosity, but as a growing, writhing mass. The scene is less a dance and more like a collective seizure set to an unheard, frantic beat. Imagine the soundscape now. It's no longer just the slap of one person's feet. It's a cacophony of dozens of pairs of shoes, or bare feet, pounding the cobblestones, the swish and rustle of rough-spun clothing, the heavy, collective breathing, punctuated by gasps, perhaps moans, or even occasional shouts or cries. Historians still argue whether these vocalizations were expressions of pain, religious ecstasy, or simply involuntary sounds forced out by the violent exertion. It's a grim symphony of human distress. The initial onlookers, who might have felt a degree of pity or even morbid fascination for Frau Troffea, are now faced with something far more alarming. This isn't just one unfortunate woman. This is an epidemic, a dancing plague. The term itself sounds almost whimsical, but the reality you're witnessing is anything but. There's a palpable sense of panic starting to ripple through the city. Shopkeepers hastily shutter their windows. Parents pull their children indoors, away from the disturbing spectacle. Whispers begin to fly. Is it witchcraft? A divine curse brought upon the city for its sins? Or some new, terrifying disease that spreads not through coughs or sneezes, but through sight or sheer proximity? One quirky and deeply unsettling tidbit from the accounts is the apparent lack of interaction between the dancers. They aren't holding hands and skipping in a circle. They aren't acknowledging each other's presence. Each individual seems locked in their own private world of frenetic movement, a solitary agony performed in public, side by side with others enduring the same. It's like a room full of people all having separate, simultaneous nightmares, but with their eyes open and their bodies in violent motion. If this was a party, it was one where everyone was determinedly ignoring everyone else while having the worst time of their lives. The authorities, the usually staid and sober members of the Strasbourg City Council, are, at this point, likely observing with growing horror and utter bewilderment. There's no handbook for this, no precedent in their civic records for dealing with a spontaneous, ever-expanding troupe of involuntary marathon dancers. What do you even call this? Their initial reaction is probably one of stunned inaction, hoping it will simply stop. A vain hope, as it turns out. The number of afflicted individuals continues to climb. 30 becomes 50. 50, 100. The dance floor is now the city itself. The precise mechanism by which the dance spread, whether through direct mimicry, shared psychological vulnerability, or some other unknown factor, is still a subject of intense discussion among historians and psychologists. Did seeing others dance somehow trigger a latent susceptibility in certain individuals? Was it a form of mass suggestion, amplified by the anxieties and superstitions of the age? Or was there something else, something unseen, at play? You watch as families try to restrain their afflicted loved ones, only to find them possessed of a desperate, almost supernatural strength, breaking free to rejoin the Stygian disco. There are reports of dancers collapsing from sheer exhaustion, their hearts giving out, only for others to step, or rather, lurch into their places. The phenomenon shows no signs of abating. It feeds on itself, growing larger, more conspicuous, more terrifying with each passing day, with each new unwilling participant. Strasbourg, a city usually bustling with purposeful commerce and pious observance, is now host to a grotesque, unstoppable carnival of despair. The summer sun continues to beat down, indifferent to the human misery unfolding beneath it. The city is on edge, teetering on the brink of a full-blown crisis, with no clear idea of what is causing this bizarre affliction or how to make it end. The footwork is indeed contagious, and it's a contagion of chaos. You're now embedded deeper into the summer of 1518 in Strasbourg, and the scene has escalated from a bizarre individual act to a full-blown public crisis. The handful of dancers has swelled, according to some contemporary accounts, to as many as 400 people. Imagine that, 400 individuals, men, women, and possibly even some older children, caught in this relentless, involuntary choreography. The narrow medieval streets, usually alive with the sounds of commerce and daily life, are now punctuated by the rhythmic, yet chaotic thudding of countless feet, the gasps for air, the occasional cries of pain or despair. The city is no longer just observing, it's actively suffering. This is where the Strasbourg City Council, those esteemed burghers and magistrates, can no longer simply watch from the windows of the Pfalz, their grand municipal building. The problem has literally danced its way onto their doorstep. Their initial bewilderment, that sense of, surely this will stop soon, has evaporated, replaced by a pressing need to do something. Anything. The public order is collapsing. Trade is being disrupted as people are afraid to go about their usual business. And quite frankly, it's making Strasbourg look bad. No city wants to be known as the place where everyone spontaneously boogies themselves to death. It's not great for tourism, even in the 16th century. The council convenes. Picture them, stern-faced men, probably dressed in dark, sober robes, seated around a heavy oak table. The minutes of their meetings from this period survive, providing a valuable, if somewhat detached, insight into their attempts to grapple with this unprecedented situation. Their first official response, recorded for posterity, isn't to call in doctors or priests, not immediately. Their initial concern seems to be diagnostic, in a very medieval way. They consult with the city's physicians, of course, but the prevailing medical theory of the time, based on the ancient Greek concept of the four humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, offered few clear answers for such a widespread and bizarre behavioural phenomenon. One of the mainstream historical facts we know for sure is that the council, after some deliberation, initially declared the dancing to be a natural disease caused by hot blood. This wasn't a diagnosis of a fever in the modern sense, but rather an imbalance of the humours, where an excess of hot, agitated blood was believed to be compelling the sufferers to move. It's a fascinating insight into the medieval mindset, trying to rationalise the inexplicable through the lens of their existing scientific framework. If you think about it, hot blood leading to frantic movement isn't entirely illogical, even if the underlying medical theory is a bit, shall we say, outdated. It's like blaming your phone for acting up because its pixels are feeling feisty. So, what do you do if you believe hundreds of your citizens are afflicted by an excess of hot blood that forces them to dance? Their solution, from our modern perspective, seems utterly counterintuitive, almost laughably so. They decided the afflicted needed to dance it out. Yes, you heard that right. Their prescription for uncontrollable dancing was more dancing. The logic, presumably, was that if the body was compelled to move, then facilitating that movement would allow the excess hot blood to be expelled, bringing the humours back into balance. It's like trying to put out a fire by adding more fuel, hoping it will burn itself out faster. The council's deliberations would have been tense. Historians still argue whether this decision was born of genuine, albeit misguided medical belief, or if it was a desperate attempt to control and contain the phenomenon by giving it a designated outlet. Perhaps it was a bit of both. They were in uncharted territory. There was no precedent for this in their civic memory. They had to make decisions based on the knowledge and beliefs of their time. Imagine the debate. One councilman suggesting they lock everyone up, another proposing prayer and fasting, and then someone, perhaps a physician, with a particularly confident air, asserting that the only cure for this frenzied movement was more movement. A quirky tidbit from this period is the sheer level of official organization that went into this cure. They didn't just say, "All right, everyone, keep dancing." They took steps. They designated specific locations for the dancing to occur. They cleared open spaces, perhaps in the market squares or guild halls, to prevent the dancers from injuring themselves or causing further disruption in the narrow, crowded streets. This wasn't a casual suggestion. It was an officially sanctioned, municipally managed public health intervention. It's like your local government setting up an official mosh pit to cure a sudden outbreak of headbanging. The council also issued edicts. They discussed the problem. They legislated on it. They were trying to impose order on chaos. They even, as we'll see, started to throw resources at the problem, believing they were helping. Their concern was genuine, even if their methods seem bizarre to us. They were responsible for the welfare of their city, and their city was, quite literally, dancing itself into a state of emergency. The reactions of the unaffected citizens to the council's decision must have been mixed. Some, desperate for any solution, might have embraced it. Others, perhaps more skeptical or more frightened, might have seen it as madness piled upon madness. Imagine your loved one is afflicted, their body a prisoner to this strange compulsion, and the official advice is to let them keep going, even to encourage it. It must have been a deeply unsettling time, filled with anxiety and a sense of the world turned upside down. The council members themselves were under immense pressure. They faced not only a baffling public health crisis, but also the potential for social unrest and divine displeasure. In a deeply religious age, an event of this magnitude could easily be interpreted as a sign of God's wrath. They needed to be seen to be acting, to be in control, even if they were just as bewildered as everyone else. Their serious, documented attempts to manage the dancing plague, starting with this hot blood diagnosis and the initial prescription of more dancing, mark a crucial turning point. The peculiar case of the dancing plague was no longer just a strange occurrence. It was now an official matter of state. The weight of the city's health, order, and perhaps even its soul rested on their bewigged shoulders. Their minutes capture a group of men grappling with a crisis far outside their experience, trying to apply 16th century logic to a phenomenon that still puzzles us today. You're watching the Strasbourg City Council's plan unfold. Their peculiar prescription of more dancing to cure the dancing plague, now official policy. The logic, as we've established, was that this hot blood, this frenetic energy, needed an outlet. So if people are going to dance, well, let's give them the best, most organized dance party of their lives, or more grimly, their deaths. It's a decision that seems almost designed by a committee with a very dark sense of humor. The council doesn't just idly suggest more dancing, they actively facilitate it. One of their most striking and historically verified actions was the decision to clear out public spaces and even construct temporary wooden stages or platforms specifically for the dancers. Imagine workmen, under the instruction of city officials, hammering together these structures in prominent locations like the grain market or the horse market. These weren't stages for joyful festivals or theatrical performances. They were designated arenas for this exhausting, seemingly endless ordeal. The visual is stark. The afflicted, their movements still jerky and uncontrolled, now have a dedicated, if somewhat macabre venue for their suffering. But the council's intervention didn't stop at providing a dance floor. In a move that truly elevates this historical episode into the realm of the bizarre, they hired musicians. Professional pipers, drummers, and fife players were brought in to provide musical accompaniment for the dancers. The idea, presumably, was that if the dancing was to be therapeutic, then perhaps music would help channel it, make it more rhythmic, more effective. Or perhaps they thought it would keep the dancers going, encouraging them to fully dance out the affliction. It's a bit like noticing someone is uncontrollably hiccuping and deciding the best course of action is to hire a beatboxer to provide a rhythm for their spasms. So now you see the scene transforming. The silent, or at least musically unaccompanied agony of the initial dancers is replaced by something even more surreal. The air fills with the skirl of pipes and the relentless beat of drums, a soundtrack to the unfolding human tragedy. This wasn't soothing, gentle music. This was likely loud, fast-paced, and repetitive, designed to keep energy levels high, or rather, to keep the already uncontrollably high energy from flagging. The dancers themselves, of course, had no say in the playlist. They just kept moving, their bodies flailing, now to a civic-sponsored beat. Historians still argue whether the introduction of music and dedicated stages helped or hindered the situation. Some suggest it might have exacerbated the problem, the constant rhythm and the designated performance spaces potentially reinforcing the compulsive behavior, perhaps even drawing more susceptible individuals into the fray through a kind of heightened public spectacle. It's a bit like adding strobe lights to a migraine. Others might argue the council was simply trying to bring some semblance of order to the chaos, to contain it within specific areas and times, even if their methods were, by our standards, deeply flawed. This decision, the Guildhall gamble as we might call it, referring to the guild halls which were sometimes used for these purposes, or just the general civic nature of the decision, represents a significant investment of city resources. Hiring musicians, paying for the construction of stages, this wasn't cheap. It underscores the seriousness with which the council viewed the situation and their commitment to their chosen, albeit peculiar, course of action. They were, in their own way, trying to heal their city, even if their cure looked more like a medieval rave gone terribly wrong. One quirky tidbit associated with this phase is the hiring of strong men. As the dancers continued for days, on end, many naturally began to falter, to collapse from sheer exhaustion. The council, still operating under the dance it out theory, reportedly hired able-bodied men not to stop the dancers, but to hold them up, to support their flagging bodies so they could continue their macabre marathon. Imagine these exhausted individuals, legs buckling, consciousness fading, being propped up and physically manipulated to keep them moving. It's a deeply disturbing image, transforming the scene from a strange, spontaneous outbreak into a medically sanctioned, physically enforced endurance test. It moves from peculiar to profoundly unsettling. The mainstream historical fact here is the clear documentation of these civic interventions. Chronicles from the period, like those by Irenaeus Wolfhart or the Specklin Chronicle, detail these measures. These aren't speculative embellishments. They are recorded parts of Strasbourg's official response. The city didn't just passively observe, it actively participated in and tried to manage the dancing. The atmosphere in Strasbourg must have been incredibly strange. On one hand, the ongoing, desperate dance of the afflicted. On the other, the city authorities diligently trying to orchestrate it, to provide a framework for it. You'd have the sounds of the musicians, the shouts of the strong men, encouraging or supporting the dancers, the murmurings and anxieties of the onlookers who weren't afflicted. Daily life, for those not caught in the dance, would have been severely disrupted. Fear and uncertainty would hang heavy in the summer air, as thick as the heat. What were the dancers themselves experiencing? We can only speculate. Were they aware of the music, the stages, the men holding them upright? Or were they so lost in their internal torment, so disconnected from their surroundings, that these interventions barely registered? Some accounts suggest the dancers were oblivious, their eyes glazed, their minds seemingly elsewhere. They were trapped in a physical prison of their own bodies, forced into a public performance they never auditioned for. This organized approach, this Guildhall gamble, didn't last indefinitely, largely because it became horrifyingly clear that it wasn't working. People weren't getting better. In fact, the situation seemed to be getting worse. Reports suggest that some individuals danced until they suffered broken bones, heart attacks, or strokes. The death toll, though difficult to ascertain with absolute precision, was undeniably rising. The stages, intended as places of healing, became sites of public suffering and for some, their final exhausted collapse. The well-intentioned, if profoundly misguided, efforts of the city council were leading to more harm than good. The music played on, but the cure remained elusive. You witness the failure of the Strasbourg City Council's more dancing strategy. The stages stand as monuments to a misguided hope, the hired musicians' tunes now sounding more like a dirge than a remedy. The strong men, initially tasked with keeping the dancers upright, are perhaps now more often carrying away those who have collapsed. Or worse. The death toll is mounting. The summer days drag on, each one bringing fresh waves of exhaustion and despair, but no cessation of the bizarre, involuntary movements that have gripped so many of the city's inhabitants. The hot blood theory and its accompanying treatment plan has proven to be a catastrophic miscalculation. The council members, faced with the undeniable evidence that their intervention is not only ineffective but potentially harmful, are forced to reconsider. Their initial, somewhat secular approach has failed. The atmosphere in Strasbourg is thick with fear, and in an age where faith permeated every aspect of life, it's only natural that thoughts would turn towards the supernatural, towards divine intervention, or, more ominously, demonic influence. If earthly remedies weren't working, perhaps heavenly ones were required, or, at the very least, an appeal to a higher power who specialized in this sort of thing. This is when St. Vitus makes his grand entrance into the narrative, or rather, when the desperate citizens and officials of Strasbourg turn their collective gaze towards him. St. Vitus was a Christian saint, martyred in the early 4th century under the Roman emperors Diocletian and Maximian. He was, and in some traditions still is, one of the 14 Holy Helpers, a group of saints venerated together in Catholicism, particularly in German-speaking lands, because their intercession was believed to be particularly effective against various diseases and troubles. Think of them as a kind of spiritual special ops team. The mainstream historical fact here is the direct appeal to St. Vitus as a potential cure for the dancing plague. This wasn't a fringe belief. It was a widely accepted part of the religious and cultural landscape of the time. St. Vitus, specifically, was the patron saint invoked against neurological disorders, epilepsy, and crucially, chorea, a condition characterized by jerky, involuntary movements, which later became known as St. Vitus's dance. The connection is almost too perfect. Here you have hundreds of people engaged in uncontrollable dance-like movements, and there's a saint whose celestial portfolio explicitly includes protection against just such afflictions. It's as if they had a direct hotline to a divine specialist. So, the city's strategy shifts. The stages are dismantled, or at least repurposed. The musicians are likely dismissed, their jaunty tunes replaced by prayers and solemn processions. The focus moves from a physical dancing out of the ailment to a spiritual cleansing. The city council, perhaps in consultation with the powerful ecclesiastical authorities of Strasbourg, the city was, after all, home to an influential bishopric and a magnificent cathedral, decrees that the dancers must be brought to the shrine of St. Vitus. Why St. Vitus? The legends surrounding him are quite dramatic. One popular story involves him curing the son of Emperor Diocletian from a demonic possession that caused convulsions, which could easily be interpreted as the kind of uncontrolled movements seen in the dancing plague. Therefore, if he could handle an emperor's son possessed by a demon causing him to writhe and twitch, surely he could handle a few hundred dancing Alsatians. Historians still argue whether the turn to St. Vitus was a genuine act of collective piety, a pragmatic attempt by the authorities to try anything after their initial plan failed, or a way to shift responsibility from the civic to the religious sphere. It was likely a complex mix of all these factors. The cure now involves piety, repentance, and pilgrimage. The dancers are no longer to be encouraged in their movements, but rather to be subjected to religious rites. This would have involved prayers, perhaps masses said in their name, and the direct invocation of St. Vitus for his intercession. You can imagine priests and monks moving among the afflicted, sprinkling holy water, reciting exorcism prayers if demonic influence was suspected, and trying to instill a sense of calm and spiritual focus in people who were, quite literally, out of their minds with motion. A quirky tidbit associated with this shift is the symbolism of red shoes. In some traditions and artistic depictions related to Saint Vitus and dancing manias, there's an association with red shoes being worn by the afflicted, or with shoes being offered at his shrines. While the direct evidence for red shoes playing a specific role in the 1518 Strasbourg event is somewhat thin, the broader cultural connection between Saint Vitus, dancing, and footwear is present in folklore. Perhaps the red shoes symbolized the burning torment in the feet of the dancers, or maybe they were votive offerings, a plea for the saint to soothe their tortured souls. It adds another layer of strange, symbolic detail to the already surreal proceedings. The decision to invoke Saint Vitus also served another purpose. It offered an explanation. If the dancing was a result of divine displeasure or demonic influence, and Saint Vitus was the designated intermediary, then the phenomenon, while still terrifying, was at least placed within a recognizable spiritual framework. It wasn't just random chaos. It was a trial, a test of faith, or a spiritual battle that required specific spiritual weapons. This could have brought a small measure of comfort, or at least a sense of direction, to a terrified populace. The problem, however, was that many of the dancers were in no fit state to participate in solemn religious observances. They were exhausted, disoriented, and still very much in the grip of their involuntary movements. Getting them to focus on prayer, let alone undertake a physically demanding pilgrimage to a shrine, would be an immense challenge. The transition from the more dancing phase to the pray it away with Saint Vitus phase wasn't seamless. It was born of desperation, a grasping at straws when all else had failed. The city had tried secular means, and now it was time to put its faith, quite literally, in the hands of a long-dead martyr. The hope was that St. Vitus would hear their pleas and command the dreadful dance to cease. The fate of Strasbourg's afflicted now rested on the efficacy of prayers and the benevolence of a saint known for calming troubled limbs. The decision has been made. St. Vitus is the answer. The failed experiment of municipally sponsored dance-offs is abandoned, the stages likely standing empty or being dismantled, the echoes of the hired musicians' tunes fading into the oppressive summer air. Now the focus is entirely on religious intervention. But St. Vitus wasn't just a name to be invoked in prayers whispered within Strasbourg's city walls. He had shrines, places of power where his intercession was believed to be most potent, and the primary shrine dedicated to him in that region wasn't conveniently located in Strasbourg's town square. The chosen destination for this desperate plea for divine help was the shrine of St. Vitus, located in the hills near the town of Saverne, then often known by its German name, Saarbrunn. Saverne lies some distance away from Strasbourg, a journey of roughly 25–30 miles to the northwest, nestled in the foothills of the Vosges Mountains. This wasn't a casual stroll down the road. For people in the 16th century, especially for those already in a state of extreme physical and mental distress, this was a significant undertaking. So you now witness a new, even more pitiable spectacle. The dancers, still caught in their compulsive, frenetic movements, are to be transported to Saverne. How do you move several hundred people who cannot control their own bodies, many of whom are delirious with exhaustion and possibly on the brink of collapse? It's a logistical nightmare. Historical accounts suggest they were loaded onto wagons, carts, anything that could convey them. Imagine these rough, unsprung vehicles jolting over uneven dirt roads, each bump sending fresh waves of agony through the already tormented bodies of the dancers. Some may have been tied down to prevent them from leaping out or injuring themselves further, their limbs still twitching and jerking even in restraint. The journey itself would have been an ordeal. Remember, it's still high summer, the heat relentless. The roads are dusty. The provision of food and water for such a large, incapacitated group would have been a massive challenge. Who organized this exodus? Most likely, it was a combination of city officials, perhaps members of religious orders, and desperate family members. The scene is one of profound misery. A slow-moving caravan of suffering, wending its way through the Alsatian countryside. A bizarre pilgrimage not of devout, willing souls, but of bodies held captive by an unseen force. The mainstream historical Fact is, this forced pilgrimage to the shrine at Saverne, contemporary chroniclers such as Sebastian Brandt, the famed author of Ship of Fools, who was a Strasbourg city official around this time, and others document this extraordinary measure. It wasn't just a few individuals making a private journey, it was a large-scale, organized, and desperate attempt to seek supernatural aid. The city of Strasbourg was, in essence, outsourcing its crisis to St. Vitus via his earthly address in the hills above Saverne. As they travelled, what would the people in the villages and countryside they passed through have thought? News of the dancing plague in Strasbourg would surely have spread. Seeing this grim procession, wagons filled with twitching, moaning figures escorted by anxious-looking attendants, must have been a terrifying sight, perhaps confirming their fears of witchcraft, divine punishment, or the end of days. It's unlikely they were met with open arms and offers of refreshment. More likely, doors were barred and prayers hastily muttered for protection. Once they reached the vicinity of Saverne, the dancers were taken up to the caves and the chapel dedicated to St. Vitus. This shrine was not a grand cathedral, but likely a more rustic, perhaps slightly eerie place, fitting for a saint associated with healing from such wild, untamed afflictions. Here, the religious rituals intensified. The dancers, or what was left of their conscious selves, were made to participate in masses. Priests would have prayed over them, perhaps anointing them with holy oil or water from a sacred spring associated with the shrine. Small wax effigies or images of St. Vitus might have been given to them, or placed upon their afflicted limbs. They were, in essence, subjected to a concentrated dose of religious therapy. A quirky and rather poignant tidbit related to this specific shrine, and the rituals performed there, involves the offering of shoes. There are accounts from various St. Vitus shrines, including potentially the one near Saverne, of people leaving shoes, sometimes red shoes, as we mentioned earlier, as votive offerings. The symbolism is potent, offering up the instruments of their torment, their worn-out dancing shoes, in the hope that the saint would grant them rest. Imagine the scene at the shrine, a collection of battered, dusty footwear, a silent testament to the agony endured by those who had sought relief there. Historians still argue whether specific, standardized rituals were performed for the dancing plague sufferers at Saverne, or if it was a more improvised series of prayers and appeals based on local tradition. The efficacy of this journey and the rituals at the shrine is, as with many aspects of the dancing plague, debated and unclear. Some contemporary accounts suggest that a number of the dancers did indeed find relief after their visit to Saverne. They reportedly stopped dancing, their bodies finally still. Was it the power of St. Vitus? Was it the sheer exhaustion, finally, overcoming the compulsion? Was it the psychological impact of such a dramatic and focused religious intervention, a sort of placebo effect on a grand scale? Or had the mysterious ailment simply run its course in these individuals? However, it's also likely that not everyone was cured. Some may have died en route, or at the shrine itself. Others may have continued to dance, their affliction impervious even to the concentrated spiritual power of St. Vitus. The chronicles are not entirely consistent on the outcomes, which is typical for historical accounts of such chaotic events. What is clear is that the journey to Saverne represents the peak of the religious response to the dancing plague of 1518. It was the most extreme measure taken, a desperate gamble on faith when all else had failed. The image of those wagons, laden with their twitching human cargo, crawling towards a distant shrine, remains one of the most haunting and enduring legacies of this peculiar episode. The hope of an entire city and the fate of hundreds of its citizens rested on what would happen in that sacred, remote place. You've journeyed with the afflicted to the shrine of St. Vitus near Saverne, witnessed the desperate prayers, the offerings, the sheer exhaustion, and while some accounts suggest a degree of success there, the dancing plague, as a phenomenon, didn't just magically vanish from historical discussion. The sheer strangeness of it, the hundreds of people compulsively dancing for weeks, sometimes to their deaths, has naturally led to a search for more tangible explanations than hot blood or the intervention of saints. and one of the most prominent, most debated, and frankly most compelling scientific theories to emerge over the centuries centers on a tiny, insidious culprit, a fungus called Claviceps purpurea, more commonly known as ergot. This brings us to the theory of ergotism, or St. Anthony's fire, as one form of it was historically known. Another saint, another fire. History loves its dramatic naming conventions. Ergot is a fungus that can grow on rye and other cereal grains, particularly in damp, cool conditions following a wet spring and leading into a warm, moist harvest, conditions that were not uncommon in Rhine Valley regions like Alsace. If this contaminated rye was then harvested, milled into flour, and baked into bread, a staple food for the vast majority of the population in 16th century Europe, people would ingest the psychoactive and toxic alkaloids produced by the fungus. Imagine you're a peasant or a common townsperson in Strasbourg in 1518. Your diet is heavily reliant on bread, likely dark rye bread, as wheat was often more expensive. You wouldn't have the luxury of being picky about slightly discolored or off-tasting flour. You eat what's available. Unbeknownst to you, the rye that went into your daily loaf might have been infected with these little purplish-black, horn-like fungal growths, the sclerosia of Claviceps purpurea. These sclerosia contain a potent cocktail of ergot alkaloids, some of which are chemically related to LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide. In fact, Albert Hofmann, the Swiss chemist who first synthesized LSD, was originally working with ergot alkaloids. That's a mainstream historical fact. The chemical link between ergot and hallucinogenic compounds is well established. Ergot poisoning, or ergotism, can manifest in two primary forms: gangrenous and convulsive. Gangrenous ergotism, often called St. Anthony's fire, due to the burning sensations in the limbs, leads to vasoconstriction, restricting blood flow to the extremities. This can cause excruciating pain, blisters, mummification of the affected tissues, and eventually the loss of fingers, toes, or entire limbs. It's a horrific condition, but it doesn't quite fit the primary symptom of the dancing plague, the compulsive movement. However, convulsive ergotism is where the theory gains traction in relation to the Strasbourg incident. Symptoms of convulsive ergotism include painful muscle spasms, writhing, twitching, contortions of the limbs, tremors, and crucially, psychological disturbances such as mania, psychosis, delirium, and hallucinations. Suddenly, the image of hundreds of people dancing erratically, their bodies seemingly out of their control, their minds perhaps lost in a waking nightmare, starts to align with the known effects of this type of poisoning. The dancing could have been a desperate, involuntary response to agonizing muscle cramps and spasms, coupled with a profound alteration of mental state. It's not a joyful dance, it's a torment. Historians and scientists who support the ergotism theory point to several factors. Firstly, the timing. Outbreaks of ergotism have historically coincided with periods of wet weather, followed by the consumption of rye. Strasbourg in 1518 had apparently experienced such conditions. Secondly, the symptoms, particularly the convulsive form, bear a striking resemblance to the descriptions of the dancers. The flailing limbs, the contortions, the apparent delirium, all are consistent with ergot poisoning. Historians still argue whether the collective nature of the dancing plague can be fully explained by ergotism alone, or if other psychological factors were also at play, perhaps exacerbated by the fungus. Consider the sheer misery of convulsive ergotism. It's not just uncontrolled movement, it's often accompanied by severe gastrointestinal upset, vomiting, diarrhea, as well as intense headaches and a terrifying sense of anxiety or dread. If many people in a community were experiencing these symptoms simultaneously after consuming contaminated bread from a common source, it could indeed look like a plague of bizarre behavior. Their dancing might have been less of a coordinated activity and more a collection of individual agonizing responses to the poison coursing through their veins. A quirky, or rather grimly fascinating tidbit about ergot is its historical impact beyond isolated outbreaks. Some scholars have controversially suggested that ergot poisoning might have played a role in other historical anomalies, such as accusations of witchcraft in various communities, including, some have speculated, Salem. The bizarre behavior, hallucinations, and physical contortions caused by the fungus could have been misinterpreted as demonic possession or malevolent witchcraft in an era quick to find supernatural explanations. While highly speculative for events like Salem, the documented effects of ergot on behavior are undeniable. The theory is compelling. It offers a scientific, biological explanation for an event that otherwise seems to defy rational understanding. You've got the source, contaminated rye, the mechanism, ingestion of ergot alkaloids, and the symptoms, convulsive movements, psychological distress. It paints a picture of Strasbourg not as a city gripped by a mysterious dance fever, but as a community unknowingly poisoning itself with its daily bread. The frantic movements cease to be a dance and become the outward manifestation of an internal, toxic agony. However, the ergotism theory is not without its critics and complexities, which we will explore. But for now, you are standing in a field of rye, somewhere outside Strasbourg, the grain heavy and ripe for harvest. You notice the telltale dark spurs of the ergot fungus on some of the stalks. A seemingly innocuous agricultural detail, yet potentially holding the key to understanding why hundreds of people, a few months later, would be caught in a desperate, unending waltz. The bread, the staff of life, could have become, for a tragic period, a source of madness and torment. The twisted waltz of the dancers might have begun in the very fields that were meant to sustain them. You've just explored the compelling, almost neat explanation of ergotism. The idea of a fungal poison inadvertently baked into the daily bread, turning a city's populace into a writhing, hallucinating mass, seems to tick many of the boxes for the dancing plague of 1518. It provides a tangible, scientific cause for the bizarre symptoms, moving the event from the realm of the purely supernatural or psychological into the sphere of toxicology. However, as with many historical mysteries, the moment you think you've found the definitive answer, counter-arguments and inconsistencies begin to emerge. The case for ergotism, while strong, isn't watertight. One of the primary challenges to the ergot theory, and a point that historians still argue heatedly, is the nature of the dancing itself. While convulsive ergotism certainly causes muscle spasms, twitching, and contortions, the descriptions of the Strasbourg event often emphasize a more coordinated, albeit frantic and uncontrolled form of movement that lasted for days, even weeks, in some individuals. Many scholars question whether the specific physical manifestations of ergot poisoning would produce such sustained, rhythmic, even if chaotic activity that could be described as dancing. Severe muscle cramps and convulsions are debilitating. They don't typically lend themselves to the kind of endurance reportedly shown by some of the Strasbourg dancers. Could someone truly dance for 6 days straight while suffering the full throes of convulsive ergotism, which often includes severe pain, nausea, and diarrhea? It seems unlikely. Furthermore, the number of people affected and the geographical concentration also raise questions. Ergot contamination of grain supplies would likely affect a broad swathe of the population consuming bread from that source. While hundreds were afflicted by the dancing plague, Strasbourg was a city of many, thousands. Why weren't more people showing symptoms of ergot poisoning if it was widespread in the grain? Were only certain batches of rye contaminated? Or did only a susceptible few react with the dancing symptoms, while others suffered different, perhaps less conspicuous, effects of ergotism or none at all? The selectivity of the dancing plague is a puzzle. Another significant point of contention is the reported lack of other classic symptoms of ergotism in many of the dancers. Convulsive ergotism, as we mentioned, is often accompanied by severe gastrointestinal distress, intense headaches, and sometimes the terrifying gangrenous symptoms of St. Anthony's fire, leading to blackened, decaying extremities. While the historical accounts from 1518 are not detailed clinical case studies, they tend to focus overwhelmingly on the dancing itself. If hundreds of people were suffering from acute ergot poisoning, one might expect more mention of these other debilitating and highly visible symptoms. The absence of widespread reports of gangrene, for instance, is a notable silence in the chronicles. One mainstream historical fact that complicates the ergot theory is that ergotism was a known phenomenon in the medieval and early modern periods. It was often called St. Anthony's fire for the gangrenous form, or sometimes ignis sacer, holy fire. Physicians and chroniclers were familiar with its gruesome effects. If the dancing plague were simply a straightforward outbreak of convulsive ergotism, wouldn't contemporary observers, particularly the physicians consulted by the Strasbourg City Council, have recognized it as such, or at least noted similarities to known outbreaks of ignis sacer? Their initial diagnosis of hot blood and their subsequent turn to St. Vitus, patron against chorea-like afflictions, rather than St. Anthony, patron against ergotism, suggests they perceived it as something different. Then there's the heat. The dancing plague of 1518 occurred in July and August, during a significant heat wave. Ergot alkaloids are known to cause vasoconstriction, which can impair the body's ability to regulate temperature. Dancing manically for days in extreme heat, while potentially suffering from ergot-induced vasoconstriction, would likely lead to rapid and fatal hypothermia. While people certainly did die, the sheer duration of the dancing in some individuals seems to argue against a condition that would make them so exquisitely vulnerable to heat stroke. A quirky, or perhaps inconvenient tidbit for the ergot theory is the apparent cure at the shrine of St. Vitus for some individuals. If the condition was purely a matter of ingesting a toxin, then prayers and pilgrimage, however fervent, should have no direct physiological effect on the course of the poisoning. The body would still need to metabolize and excrete the alkaloids. While the power of suggestion and psychological factors, which we'll explore next, could certainly play a role in how symptoms are experienced or expressed, a purely toxicological explanation struggles to account for sudden recoveries attributed to religious intervention. It doesn't mean ergot wasn't a factor, but it suggests it might not be the only factor. Some scholars propose a threshold theory, perhaps a low level of ergot poisoning, not enough to cause full-blown convulsive ergotism in everyone, created a heightened state of anxiety, suggestibility, and physical discomfort in a population already under immense stress. This underlying physiological malaise could then have been ignited into full-blown dancing by psychological and social triggers. In this view, ergotism isn't the sole cause, but a contributing physiological stressor that made the population more vulnerable to a different kind of contagion, a psychological one. So, while the image of hallucinogenic bread causing a city to dance is incredibly vivid and provides a neat scientific box, the fit isn't perfect. The specific nature and duration of the dancing, the selectivity of the affliction, the lack of other prominent ergotism symptoms in the accounts, and the contemporary medical understanding, or lack thereof, all cast shadows of doubt on ergotism as the sole and complete explanation. The fungus in the rye might have been a sinister actor in the drama, but perhaps it didn't have the starring role some have assigned to it. The doubts about the fungus push us to look for other explanations, or at least complementary ones, that might help unravel this peculiar historical knot. You've sifted through the arguments for and against ergotism, the theory of poisoned rye bread leading to a city's convulsive dance. While it offers a compelling biological angle, the inconsistencies have left room for other explanations to flourish. If not a fungus, or not just a fungus, then what else could have driven hundreds of people in Strasbourg to dance themselves to the brink of death, and sometimes beyond? This leads us to one of the most widely accepted, though perhaps less viscerally, dramatic theories: mass psychogenic illness, also known as mass hysteria. Imagine the mental landscape of early 16th century Europe. It's a world steeped in fervent religious belief, where the supernatural is an everyday reality, and life is often precarious, subject to famine, disease, and war. Social anxieties are rife. Now, picture Frau Trophäa beginning her inexplicable dance In such a charged atmosphere, her bizarre behavior acts as a spark in a tinderbox of collective stress. Mass psychogenic illness typically involves the rapid spread of illness symptoms within a cohesive group where there's no corresponding infectious agent or environmental toxin identifiable as the primary cause. Instead, the illness spreads through sight, suggestion, and shared psychological distress. The mainstream historical fact supporting this theory is that outbreaks of similar dancing manias or other collective behavioral disturbances have been recorded at various times and places throughout history, often during periods of significant social stress. The Strasbourg event of 1518 is perhaps the most famous, but it's not entirely unique. This recurrence suggests a pattern linked more to human psychology and social dynamics than to isolated specific environmental toxins that would only appear sporadically. So, how does mass hysteria take hold? It often begins with an index case, in this instance, Frau Trophäa. Her public, unexplained, and highly visible distress captures attention. Others, already anxious or psychologically vulnerable, witness her behavior. Through a process of social contagion, they begin to exhibit similar symptoms. It's not conscious imitation, not people deciding to join a fun dance. Rather, it's a subconscious adoption of the behaviors and perceived afflictions of others, particularly when those behaviors are dramatic and unexplained. It's like a collective anxiety attack, manifesting physically. Think about the power of suggestion in a pre-scientific age. If you see someone else seemingly possessed by an uncontrollable urge to dance, and you yourself are living under immense pressure, feeling anxious and perhaps powerless, the idea that you too could be infected or seized by the same affliction might take root in your subconscious. Your own anxieties and stresses could then manifest in the same physical way, the dancing. Historians still argue whether the term hysteria itself is appropriate, given its somewhat loaded historical connotations, particularly regarding women. But the concept of a psychologically driven, collectively manifested physical response remains a strong contender. One of the key characteristics of mass psychogenic illness is that the symptoms, while very real to the sufferer, often don't conform to known patterns of organic disease. The dancing plague, with its prolonged, specific activity, fits this. While ergotism has its own distinct symptomology, the dancing in 1518 was highly specific and, crucially, seemed to spread by observation or proximity. You don't catch ergot poisoning by watching someone else eat bread, but you can be psychologically influenced by witnessing extreme behavior in a high-stress environment. A quirky or fringe tidbit in the realm of mass hysteria involves the mirror neuron system in the human brain. Mirror neurons are brain cells that fire both when an animal acts and when the animal observes the same action performed by another. While the science is still evolving, some researchers have speculated that this system might play a role in empathy, learning, and also potentially in the spread of contagious behaviors seen in mass psychogenic illness. Could it be that watching Frau Trophäa's frantic movements day after day literally primed the brains of susceptible onlookers to replicate those movements, especially when combined with extreme emotional distress? It's speculative, but offers a potential neurological underpinning for how such a thing could spread. The conditions in Strasbourg in 1518 were certainly ripe for such an outbreak. As we'll delve into more deeply later, the city was experiencing significant social, economic, and religious upheaval. Famine, poverty, and the recent ravages of diseases like syphilis and leprosy created a backdrop of fear and uncertainty. The advent of the Reformation was also beginning to challenge long-held religious beliefs, adding another layer of spiritual anxiety. In such an environment, a collective psychological break, manifesting as the dancing plague, becomes a more plausible scenario. The dancing itself could have been a desperate, unconscious outlet for unbearable psychological tension. Consider the interventions. The city council building stages and hiring musicians. If the root cause was psychological, these actions, though well-intentioned, might have inadvertently validated and amplified the phenomenon. By officially recognizing the dancing, giving it a venue, and even providing a soundtrack, The authorities may have reinforced the idea that this was a legitimate, widespread affliction, potentially making it easier for others to succumb to it through suggestion. It's like telling someone who thinks they might be sick, "Oh yes, you're definitely sick, and here's a special bed and some music for your sickness." The recovery of some individuals at the shrine of St. Vitus also makes more sense through the lens of mass psychogenic illness. If the condition is psychologically rooted, then a powerful psychological intervention, such as a dramatic pilgrimage, intense religious rituals, and the collective belief in the healing power of a saint, could indeed produce a cure. The strong suggestion that St. Vitus could heal them, combined with the profound emotional and spiritual experience of the pilgrimage, might have been enough to break the psychological cycle for some sufferers. The theory of mass psychogenic illness doesn't mean the suffering wasn't real. The exhaustion, the pain, the terror, these were undoubtedly genuine experiences for those caught in the dance. But it shifts the cause from an external poison to an internal, albeit collective, psychological state. The plague was one of the mind spreading through the invisible pathways of shared anxiety and social contagion. It's a more subtle, but perhaps even more unsettling explanation than ergotism. It suggests that under the right conditions of extreme stress and social pressure, the human mind can collectively generate its own extraordinary and terrifying physical manifestations. The dance was not in the bread, but in their heads, projected outwards onto the cobblestones of Strasbourg. You've seen how mass psychogenic illness offers a compelling framework for understanding the dancing plague, suggesting the contagion was psychological, spreading through shared stress and suggestion. But for such a widespread and extreme manifestation to take hold, the underlying stress levels in the community must have been exceptionally high. So, let's pull back the lens from the individual dancers and look at the broader context. What was life actually like in Strasbourg and the surrounding Alsace region in the early 16th century? It was, to put it mildly, a pressure cooker. Strasbourg in 1518 was a city teetering on the edge of profound change and already burdened by numerous hardships. This wasn't a peaceful, idyllic medieval town, rudely interrupted by a strange dance. It was a community already grappling with a potent cocktail of social, economic, and religious anxieties. These pre-existing conditions are crucial to understanding why a phenomenon like the dancing plague could erupt and spread with such alarming ferocity. First, let's consider the economic hardships. The decades leading up to 1518 had seen a series of poor harvests and famines in the Upper Rhine region, including Alsace. When crops failed, the price of grain, the absolute staple of the common diet, remember our friend rye bread, would skyrocket. This meant hunger, malnutrition, and outright starvation for many, particularly the urban poor and rural peasants. The winter preceding the summer of 1518 was reportedly harsh, and there are records indicating significant food shortages and inflated prices in Strasbourg that year. People were literally starving. Malnutrition weakens the body and also frays the nerves, making individuals more susceptible to both physical illness and psychological distress. Imagine the constant gnawing anxiety of not knowing where your next meal is coming from, or watching your children go hungry. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an existential threat. Then there were the diseases. The early 16th century was a brutal time in terms of public health. Outbreaks of devastating illnesses were common and terrifying. Plague, the Black Death and its subsequent waves, was an ever-present shadow, capable of wiping out huge portions of the population. Leprosy was still a dreaded affliction, leading to social ostracization. And a new, terrifying disease had recently arrived in Europe: syphilis. Known then as the French pox, or the Great Pox, it caused horrific symptoms and spread rapidly. Strasbourg, as a busy trading city, would have been vulnerable to all these. One mainstream historical fact is that Strasbourg had established a pox house, or pest house, specifically for syphilis sufferers in the late 15th century, indicating the disease was a recognized and serious problem. The fear of sudden, painful, and disfiguring illness was a constant companion for people of this era. Social unrest was also simmering. The feudal system, with its rigid hierarchies and the heavy burdens placed on the peasantry, was creating deep resentments. The decades around 1518 were a prelude to the massive German Peasants' War of 1524–1525, a widespread revolt fueled by economic desperation and a desire for social justice. Alsace was one of the regions heavily involved in these precursor agitations. There was a sense of injustice, of exploitation, and a growing anger among the common people against both the nobility and the wealthy urban elites. This undercurrent of social tension would have added to the general feeling of instability and anxiety. And then, perhaps most profoundly, there was the religious turmoil. The year 1518 is highly significant because it's the year after Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses in Wittenberg, October 1517, effectively kickstarting the Protestant Reformation. While the full force of the Reformation hadn't yet swept through Strasbourg by the summer of 1518, the ideas were beginning to circulate. Luther's challenge to the authority of the Pope and the established doctrines of the Catholic Church was creating immense spiritual uncertainty and division. For centuries, the Church had provided a stable, unifying framework for understanding the world and one's place in it. Now, that framework was being questioned. This wasn't just an intellectual debate for theologians. It had profound implications for everyone's salvation, their relationship with God, and the very fabric of their society. Historians still argue about the exact speed and impact of these early Reformation ideas in Strasbourg in 1518, but the seeds of doubt and spiritual anxiety were undoubtedly being sown. A quirky and telling detail from this period is the proliferation of apocalyptic prophecies and beliefs. Many people genuinely believed they were living in the end times. The famines, the new diseases, the social unrest, the challenges to the church, all could be interpreted as signs of impending divine judgment or the arrival of the Antichrist. This apocalyptic mindset would have created a fertile ground for extreme behaviors and a heightened sensitivity to anything perceived as an omen or a supernatural manifestation. If you believe the world is about to end, seeing hundreds of people dancing uncontrollably might seem like just another terrifying sign fulfilling ancient prophecies. Remember those printed pamphlets we mentioned earlier? Some of them would have been spreading these very apocalyptic ideas. So you have a population that is likely malnourished, terrified of disease, resentful of social inequities, and deeply anxious about their spiritual salvation and the state of the world. It's a community stretched to its psychological breaking point. In this context, the dancing plague doesn't seem quite so inexplicable. It could be seen as a collective abreaction, a physical manifestation of intolerable, multifaceted stress. The individual anxieties and fears, finding no other outlet, might have erupted in this bizarre, contagious behavior. Frau Troffea's initial dance, whatever its personal cause, became the focal point onto which all these simmering societal anxieties could latch. The city under stress was a powder keg. The dancing plague was the match. It wasn't just about Frau Troffea or ergot, or even St. Vitus. It was about a confluence of unbearable pressures crashing down on a vulnerable population. The streets of Strasbourg became an arena not just for a peculiar dance, but for the expression of a deep-seated societal malaise. Understanding this backdrop of extreme hardship and anxiety is crucial to understanding why so many might have succumbed to such an extraordinary affliction. You've explored the crushing social, economic, and religious pressures bearing down on Strasbourg in 1518, creating a fertile ground for an outbreak like the dancing plague. The city was a tinderbox of anxiety, and the strange dance was the spark. Now, let's introduce a rather famous and famously iconoclastic figure who was contemporary to these events and offered his own unique and somewhat disdainful perspective. Theophrastus von Hohenheim, better known as Paracelsus. Paracelsus was a Swiss physician, alchemist, lay theologian, and philosopher of the German Renaissance. He was a controversial figure, known for rejecting the then-dominant medical theories of Galen and Avicenna, often burning their books publicly. He advocated for a medicine based on observation and experience, and for the use of chemical remedies rather than relying solely on traditional herbal concoctions or humoral theory. He was, in many ways, ahead of his time, though also deeply embedded in the mystical and alchemical traditions of his era. Think of him as a sort of 16th century Dr. House, brilliant, abrasive, and not afraid to overturn the established order. While Paracelsus wasn't in Strasbourg during the peak of the 1518 dancing plague, he visited the city a few years later, around 1526 to 1528, and even served briefly as its town physician. He was certainly aware of such phenomena. Dancing manias, though perhaps not on the scale of Strasbourg 1518, were not entirely unknown in the region. Paracelsus wrote about conditions that caused involuntary movements and psychological disturbances, and his theories offer a fascinating contemporary medical viewpoint, distinct from the city council's hot blood or the purely religious explanations. 1. Mainstream historical fact is that Paracelsus did address the dancing plague, or chorea lasciva, as he sometimes termed it, in his writings. He didn't attribute it to demonic possession or necessarily to divine punishment in the way many of his contemporaries might have. Instead, he proposed a more naturalistic, though still very 16th century, explanation. He believed that this particular form of dancing mania was caused by Frau Venus, essentially attributing it to frustrated sexual desire or hot, unfulfilled passions, particularly in women. His diagnosis, in his work Von den Krankheiten, die den Menschen der Vernunft berauben, on the diseases that deprive men of reason, points towards a psychological and physiological cause rooted in what he called libidinous, or lascivious, imaginings. Paracelsus theorized that these hot-blooded desires, if unfulfilled or suppressed, could manifest as physical compulsions, including the frantic dancing. He categorized different types of chorea, a term for involuntary movements. There was chorea naturalis, natural chorea, perhaps from organic causes; chorea imaginativa, caused by imagination, which could link to mass hysteria; and this chorea lasciva, caused by lustful desires. For Frau Trophea, the instigator of the Strasbourg plague, he offered a rather uncharitable and specific diagnosis. He suggested her dancing was a deliberate ploy to shame her husband, possibly stemming from marital discord or her own hot and shameless nature. His opinion was that she simply didn't want to stop dancing, and that others then followed suit due to their own similar suppressed desires, or through mere imitation. This is Paracelsus's puzzling and somewhat dismissive diagnosis. It's a far cry from ergot poisoning or mass hysteria as we understand it today, but it does represent an attempt to find a cause within the individual's psychological and physiological state, rather than solely external supernatural forces. His focus on imagination and desires as causative agents actually resonates, in a way, with modern psychological theories about conversion disorders or psychogenic illnesses, where intense emotional conflicts can manifest as physical symptoms. However, his specific attribution to lascivious urges, particularly concerning women, reflects the gender biases of his time. It's a bit like blaming a societal problem on everyone just being a bit too frisky. A quirky tidbit regarding Paracelsus's general medical approach was his belief in like cures like, a concept that later formed a basis for homeopathy, though Paracelsus's application was different, and his emphasis on the signatures of plants and minerals, the idea that their appearance could indicate their medicinal use. For instance, a plant with heart-shaped leaves might be good for heart conditions. While this might seem fanciful, it was part of his broader attempt to find a divinely ordained order and correspondence in nature. For the dancing plague, his proposed cure for chorea lasciva often involved attempts to satisfy or redirect these supposed hot desires, or sometimes rather harshly, through shaming or disciplinary measures to curb the willful behavior. He wasn't a fan of mollycoddling what he perceived as self-indulgent ailments. Historians still argue about how much direct knowledge Paracelsus had of the 1518 Strasbourg event versus other, perhaps smaller, outbreaks of dancing. His writings on chorea are general, but his proximity in time and region makes it highly likely he was referencing phenomena like the one in Strasbourg. His disdain for the purely supernatural explanations, and his attempt to frame it in terms of internal, albeit controversially defined, human drives, marks him as a transitional figure between medieval superstition and more modern, empirical medical thought. His diagnosis of chorea lasciva, particularly his specific comments about Frau Trophea, if indeed he was referring to her directly, as some scholars believe, would have been quite shocking and dismissive to those who saw the dancers as victims of a terrible affliction, whether divine, demonic, or medical. To suggest it was all down to wanting to shame a husband or due to unchecked libido would have seemed callous. Yet Paracelsus was rarely one for gentle bedside manner. He was a medical rebel, and his opinions often flew in the face of convention. So, while the Strasbourg City Council was struggling with hot blood and then turning to St. Vitus, and while we moderns debate ergotism versus mass hysteria, Paracelsus, from his slightly later vantage point, was pointing a finger at human passions and frustrated desires. His theory, while not aligning with our current understanding, adds another layer to the rich tapestry of interpretations surrounding this bizarre event. It reminds us that even contemporary experts could view the same phenomenon through vastly different and sometimes quite judgmental lenses. His slightly scandalous take offers a window into the less pious, more worldly explanations that also circulated in the 16th century, even if they don't fully satisfy our quest for the definitive cause. You've heard Paracelsus's rather provocative take on the dancing plague, attributing it to chorea lasciva and frustrated desires. While his specific diagnosis might seem a bit archaic and judgmental, his awareness of such phenomena points to a crucial fact. The dancing plague of Strasbourg in 1518, while exceptionally well documented and large in scale, was not an entirely isolated incident in the annals of history. It was part of a recurring pattern of dancing manias, or similar outbreaks of collective ecstatic or convulsive behavior, particularly in Europe during the medieval and early modern periods. These echoes of ecstasy, or agony as the case may be, provide a broader context for understanding the Strasbourg event. Looking back, we find chronicles detailing similar episodes sprinkled across several centuries, primarily in German-speaking lands, the Netherlands, and Italy. These weren't identical, but they shared core features: groups of people spontaneously engaging in prolonged, uncontrollable dancing or similar convulsive movements, often to the point of exhaustion or collapse. One of the earliest well-documented precursors occurred in 1021 in Kölbig, Saxony, Germany, where a group of people reportedly danced and sang uncontrollably in a churchyard on Christmas Eve, supposedly as a divine punishment for irreverent behavior. They were said to have continued for a year, unable to stop. It's a story shrouded in legend, but it sets a precedent. Then there's the famous children's dance of Erfurt in 1237, where hundreds of children allegedly danced their way out of the city towards Arnstadt, many reportedly dying from exhaustion or disappearing. While some historians question the veracity or scale of this specific event, it, along with other tales like the Pied Piper of Hamelin, dated to 1284, though the dancing element is a later embellishment, taps into a recurring motif of unexplained, collective movement, particularly involving the young or vulnerable. The 14th and 15th centuries saw a significant upsurge in these dancing manias, especially in the Rhine Valley and the Low Countries. One mainstream historical fact is the outbreak in Aachen, Aix-la-Chapelle, in 1374, which was particularly widespread and well documented. Thousands of people in Aachen and surrounding towns were seized by an uncontrollable urge to dance, often shouting, screaming, and claiming to see visions. They would dance for hours or days, sometimes foaming at the mouth before collapsing. This outbreak spread along the Rhine through Cologne, Metz, and into parts of France and the Netherlands. Contemporary chroniclers often attributed these events to demonic possession or the wrath of God. They were frequently called chorea sancti vitae, St. Vitus's dance, even then, linking them to the saint whose intercession was sought. These earlier outbreaks share striking similarities with the Strasbourg incident. The compulsive nature of the movement, the large numbers involved, the geographical spread, often along rivers, which were key routes for travel and communication, the extreme physical exertion, and the attempts to find supernatural explanations or cures. Historians still argue whether these various outbreaks were all manifestations of the same underlying cause, or if different factors, ergotism in one case, mass hysteria in another, perhaps a combination in others, were at play depending on the specific local circumstances. A quirky or perhaps darkly fascinating tidbit is the varying social responses to these earlier manias. While some communities reacted with fear and prayer, others reportedly tried to exorcise the demons through even more dancing, sometimes with musicians hired for the purpose, a precursor to Strasbourg's ill-fated Guildhall gamble. In some Italian instances of tarantism, a phenomenon linked to the bite of a tarantula spider, though likely also a form of dancing mania, specific types of music, known as tarantellas, were believed to be therapeutic, helping the afflicted dance out the poison or the malady. The tarantella, now a joyful folk dance, has these darker, more frenzied origins. Remember our musicians in Strasbourg? Perhaps they were drawing on a folk memory of these earlier, music-assisted cures. These historical echoes are important because they show that Strasbourg 1518 wasn't a complete anomaly. It was an extreme example, perhaps the best documented, large-scale urban outbreak, but it fit within a known, if poorly understood, pattern of behavior. This makes purely localized explanations, like a single contaminated batch of rye specific only to Strasbourg in 1518, slightly less compelling on their own, and strengthens the case for factors like mass psychogenic illness, which can recur when similar societal stresses and psychological conditions are present. The context of these earlier manias also helps explain the rapid turn to St. Vitus in Strasbourg. If similar outbreaks had been occurring for centuries, and if St. Vitus had already been identified as the go-to saint for such problems, then the Strasbourg authorities were, in a sense, following an established, albeit desperate, protocol. They weren't inventing the St. Vitus cure from scratch. They were drawing on a tradition of appealing to him for dancing diseases. It's also worth noting that these manias often occurred during times of significant societal upheaval. The Blackie, death in the mid-14th century, periods of famine, religious schisms, and intense millenarian fervor. The 1374 outbreak, for example, occurred a few decades after the Black Death had ravaged Europe, leaving a legacy of trauma, social disruption, and heightened religious anxiety. This correlation between widespread stress and outbreaks of dancing mania is a strong argument for a significant psychosomatic component. By comparing Strasbourg 1518 with these other historical instances, we can see it not as a random freak occurrence, but as a particularly intense flare-up of a recurring human response to overwhelming circumstances. The specific triggers and manifestations might have varied, but the underlying vulnerability of communities to fall into these states of collective ecstatic or convulsive behavior seems to be a persistent thread in human history, especially during periods of crisis. The echoes of these earlier dances, their feet pounding the earth in Aachen, Kölbeek, or the fields of Italy, reverberate all the way to the cobblestones of Strasbourg, reminding us that the peculiar case of 1518 was one terrifying chapter in a much longer, stranger story. You've seen the dancing plague of Strasbourg in the context of other historical dancing manias, and you've considered theories ranging from ergot poisoning to mass hysteria, even Paracelsus's worldly take on frustrated desires. Now, let's delve a little deeper into the official medical thinking that was initially applied by the Strasbourg authorities themselves, beyond just a vague notion of something being wrong. Their first diagnosis, remember, was that the affliction was a natural disease caused by hot blood. This wasn't just a folksy turn of phrase. It was rooted in a complex and long-standing medical system known as humoral theory. Humoral theory, or humorism, was the dominant system of medicine in Europe from antiquity, originating with Hippocrates and significantly developed by Galen all the way through the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. even lingering into the 19th century in some forms. It's hard to overstate its influence. For centuries, it was the framework through which physicians understood health, disease, and even personality. The core idea was that the human body contained four fundamental substances, known as humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, or choler, and black bile, or melancholy. Each humour was associated with one of the four classical elements, air, water, fire, earth, respectively, and also with specific qualities, hot, cold, moist, dry. A healthy person, according to this theory, had these four humours in perfect balance. Disease arose when there was an imbalance, an excess or deficiency of one or more humours, or if a humour became corrupted or putrefied. Personality and temperament were also linked to the predominant humour in an individual. For example, someone with an excess of blood was considered sanguine, optimistic, cheerful, and also prone to being ruddy and, well, full-blooded. Excess phlegm made one phlegmatic, calm, sluggish. Excess yellow bile led to a choleric temperament, fiery, irritable, and an excess of black bile resulted in melancholy, sad, pensive, depressive. So, when the Strasbourg physicians and city council declared the dancing plague to be caused by hot blood, they were speaking the language of established medical science. Blood, as a humour, was associated with the element of air and the qualities of being hot and moist. An excess of blood, or blood that had become overly hot or agitated, was believed to cause a range of symptoms, including fever, inflammation, and significantly for our case, restlessness, agitation, and potentially manic or uncontrolled behaviour. The idea was that this superheated, overabundant blood was literally boiling up within the dancers, compelling them to move, to leap, to flail in an attempt to expend or cool this internal fire. This leads us to one of the mainstream historical facts of medical practice at the time, the widespread use of bloodletting. If you had too much blood, or bad blood, the logical treatment was to remove some of it. Bloodletting through venesection, opening a vein, or by applying leeches was an incredibly common medical intervention for a vast array of ailments, from fevers to headaches to mental disturbances. It seems barbaric to us now, and often did, more harm than good by weakening already ill patients. But within the humoral framework, it made perfect sense. If the dancers had hot blood, why wasn't bloodletting the first line of treatment in Strasbourg? This is where it gets interesting. While bloodletting was common, the Strasbourg Council, as we know, initially opted for the dance-it-out strategy. Historians still argue about this decision. Perhaps the sheer number of afflicted made widespread bloodletting impractical. Or maybe the specific type of agitation seen in the dancers suggested to the physicians that expelling the hotness through vigorous activity was a more appropriate first step than directly removing blood. It's possible they considered the hot blood to be a kind of morbid humour that needed to be physically sweated or danced out of the system, rather than simply drained. It's like trying to cool an overheating engine by running it even faster, hoping the excess heat will dissipate through sheer activity. A quirky and rather alarming tidbit related to humoral theory and its treatments involves the idea of coction or concoction. This was the belief that morbid humours needed to be cooked or ripened within the body before they could be expelled through sweat, urine, feces, or expectoration. Some treatments were designed to promote this coction. Could the Strasbourg authorities have initially thought that the dancing itself was a form of coction, a violent internal cooking that would prepare the hot blood for eventual expulsion? It's a speculative leap, but it fits the often complex and somewhat counterintuitive logic of humoral practice. The hot blood diagnosis also explains the later shift in strategy away from encouraging more dancing. When the dance-it-out method clearly failed and people were dying, it would suggest to the humoral physician that the imbalance was perhaps more severe than initially thought, or that the hotness was of a particularly malignant quality that couldn't be simply expelled through movement. This failure could then prompt a turn towards other explanatory frameworks, like the spiritual one involving St. Vitus, especially when the known physical remedies seemed ineffective or even harmful. Understanding humoral theory is crucial because it highlights how people in 1518 were trying to make sense of the dancing plague using the best scientific knowledge available to them. Their actions, however bizarre they seem to us, were not random. They were based on a coherent, albeit flawed, understanding of the human body and disease. The hot blood theory provided an immediate, naturalistic explanation that didn't initially require recourse to supernatural causes. It was only when this scientific approach failed so catastrophically that the spiritual explanations gained more traction or were pursued with greater urgency. The very idea of hot blood also connects, in a metaphorical way, to the social and emotional temperature of Strasbourg at the time. The city was metaphorically hot, with anxieties, frustrations, and passions. While the physicians were thinking of a literal humoral imbalance, it's not a huge leap to see how a population experiencing intense emotional heat might be seen as particularly susceptible to an affliction diagnosed in similar terms. The language of humoralism, with its emphasis on balance and internal states, provided a vocabulary for understanding both physical and psychological distress, even if the specific mechanisms it proposed were wide of the mark. The theory of hot blood may have been incorrect, but it was a product of its time, a genuine attempt to apply medical reasoning to an utterly baffling and terrifying crisis. You've journeyed through the streets of 16th century Strasbourg, witnessing the terrifying spectacle of the dancing plague. You've explored contemporary explanations like hot blood and Paracelsus's theories, weighed the evidence for ergotism, delved into the concept of mass psychogenic illness, and understood the immense societal pressures of the time. Now, as we draw towards a modern understanding, it becomes clear that no single theory is likely to hold the entire truth. The peculiar case of the dancing plague of 1518 was probably not the result of one isolated cause, but rather a multifaceted malady, a perfect storm brewed from a complex interplay of psychological, social, biological, and environmental factors. Modern, scholarly interpretations tend to favor a synthesis, acknowledging that while one factor might have been more dominant, others likely played crucial supporting roles. The leading contender for that dominant role, as favored by many contemporary historians like John Waller, who has written extensively on the topic, is indeed mass psychogenic illness, or mass hysteria, occurring in a population pushed to the brink by extreme stress. The evidence for severe hardship in Strasbourg, famine, disease, poverty, and profound religious anxiety, is undeniable. This created a community highly susceptible to a collective psychological breakdown. Frau Troffea's initial, unexplained dance, whatever its private origin, perhaps personal distress or a genuine neurological issue, acted as the trigger in this hyper-suggestible environment. However, this doesn't mean other factors can be entirely dismissed. Let's reconsider ergotism. While it might not have been the sole, direct cause of the highly specific, prolonged dancing in hundreds of people, it's plausible that low-level ergot contamination in the rye supply could have acted as a physiological stressor. Remember, that theory about ergot creating a heightened state of anxiety and physical discomfort. If people were already feeling unwell, anxious, perhaps experiencing mild cramps or mental fogginess from tainted bread, they might have been more prone to interpret these sensations through the lens of the developing dancing phenomenon and more easily succumb to the psychological contagion. Ergotism could have been the kindling, while mass hysteria was the spark that ignited the full blaze. This is a common approach in modern analyses of historical medical mysteries, looking for synergistic effects. It's not necessarily an either-or situation. One mainstream historical fact often cited in these synthetic approaches is the sheer duration and physical extremity of the dancing. While mass hysteria can explain the spread and the behavioral aspects, the ability of some individuals to dance for days on end, often without food or water until they collapsed or died, is still astounding. Could a mild form of ergot-induced mania, or altered pain perception have contributed to this extraordinary endurance, even as it ultimately destroyed them. It's a question scholars continue to ponder. Then there's the cultural context of trance and ecstatic states. In the early 16th century, beliefs in spirit possession, both divine and demonic, were deeply ingrained. Public displays of religious ecstasy or demonic torment were not entirely outside the realm of experience or expectation. The line between fervent religious devotion and pathological behavior could be thin. Historians still argue whether some of the dancers were genuinely experiencing a form of trance state, perhaps induced by the combination of extreme stress, religious fervor, and the suggestive power of the unfolding events. In such a state, individuals might indeed be capable of extraordinary physical feats and exhibit a detachment from pain or exhaustion. The rituals at the shrine of St. Vitus, involving prayers, music, of a different kind than the Guildhall, and powerful suggestion, could then be seen as a culturally sanctioned way to break such a trance state. A quirky, yet relevant, consideration in synthesizing these theories is the very definition of dancing. We imagine coordinated, rhythmic movement. But was it always like that? The term dance in contemporary accounts might have been a broad descriptor for any kind of agitated, convulsive, or repetitive movement that lacked obvious purpose. If someone is suffering severe muscle spasms from ergotism, or is in the throes of a hysterical fit, their movements might appear dance-like to an observer. Even if they are not consciously dancing, the language used by chroniclers, filtered through their own cultural understanding, shapes our perception of the event. Modern interpretations also emphasize the role of the authorities' reactions. The city council's decision to encourage more dancing, build stages, and hire musicians, while based on the hot blood theory, likely amplified the psychological contagion. It legitimized the behavior, made it a public spectacle, and may have inadvertently drawn more people into it. It created a feedback loop. The more people danced, the more real the affliction seemed, and the more others, already on edge, might succumb. Conversely, the later shift to a religious framework, culminating in the pilgrimage to Saverne, provided an alternative, powerful narrative and a set of rituals that offered a pathway out of the collective trance for some. So, you're looking at a web of interconnected causes. Imagine a Venn diagram. One circle is extreme psychosocial stress, poverty, famine, religious anxiety. Another is cultural beliefs, spirit possession, ecstatic trance, the power of saints. A third might be potential physiological contributors, possible low-level ergotism, malnutrition. The dancing plague of 1518 likely occurred in the overlapping section of these circles, where all these factors converged with devastating effect. This multifaceted approach doesn't diminish the suffering of those involved. It simply acknowledges that human experience, especially in times of crisis, is rarely simple. The dancers weren't just mad or poisoned or sinful. They were human beings caught in an extraordinary confluence of unfortunate circumstances, responding in a way that, while bizarre, was perhaps an understandable, if extreme, product of their time and their unbearable pressures. The search for a single magic bullet explanation gives way to a more nuanced understanding of a complex historical tragedy. The malady was indeed multifaceted, a chilling symphony composed of many discordant notes. You have journeyed from the first unsettling steps of Frau Trophäa on a hot July day in Strasbourg, through the escalating chaos, the misguided interventions, the desperate appeals to saints, and the labyrinth of theories attempting to explain it all. We've considered fungus in the bread, hysteria in the mind, the weight of a society under unbearable stress, and the echoes of similar strange dances across history. And yet, as we arrive at the close of this peculiar case, the dancing plague of 1518 still retains a core of profound enigma. Despite centuries of scrutiny and scholarly debate, it refuses to be fully and definitively demystified. The historical records, while providing vivid snapshots, are ultimately incomplete. We have the accounts of chroniclers like Sebastian Brandt, Irenaeus Wolfhart, and the Specklin family, along with city council minutes. These tell us what happened, at least from their perspective. People danced, they suffered, authorities reacted. But the deeper why, the precise internal experience of the dancers, the exact balance of contributing factors, these remain elusive, shrouded in the mists of time and the limitations of historical sources. We can't interview Frau Trofea. We can't take blood samples from the dancers to test for ergot alkaloids. We are left to interpret the shadows on the cave wall. One of the most significant lingering questions, and one that historians still argue passionately about, is the true number of fatalities. Contemporary accounts vary wildly, with some suggesting dozens of deaths, while more sensational later embellishments claim that up to 15 people a day were dying at the height of the plague. Establishing an accurate death toll is incredibly difficult. Parish records for burials from that specific period might offer clues, but correlating them directly to the dancing affliction and separating those deaths from other concurrent causes, in a city already suffering from famine and disease, is a monumental task. Did people die directly from the dancing, from heart attacks, strokes, sheer exhaustion? Or did the weeks of relentless activity fatally weaken them, making them succumb to other underlying conditions? The true human cost remains a somber, imprecise estimate. Another enduring enigma is the abruptness with which the plague eventually subsided. Most accounts suggest that by late August or early September 1518, the dancing had largely ceased. The journey to the shrine of St. Vitus in Saverne is often credited with this resolution, at least for a significant number of the afflicted. But did it stop for everyone and all at once? Or did it gradually fade away as the summer heat lessened, as perhaps a new, uncontaminated grain harvest became available? Or as the collective psychological tension found other outlets, or simply exhausted itself? The end of the dancing plague is almost as mysterious as its beginning. There was no clear, all-clear signal, no definitive moment when Strasbourg collectively breathed a sigh of relief and said, "Well, that was weird. It seems to have petered out, leaving behind a traumatized city and a perplexing historical puzzle." The very nature of the dance itself remains a subject of interpretation. Was it a truly uncontrolled, convulsive series of movements, as suggested by theories of ergotism or extreme psychogenic states? Or was there an element of ritualized, albeit desperate performance, influenced by existing cultural tropes of religious ecstasy or demonic possession dances? One mainstream historical fact is that St. Vitus's dance was already a term associated with certain neurological conditions causing involuntary movements, like Sydenham's chorea. Did the Strasbourg event simply get labelled with this existing term, or did it genuinely resemble what people understood St. Vitus's dance to be? The precise choreography of this historical ballet of despair is lost to us. A quirky and somewhat unsettling aspect of its legacy is how the dancing plague has occasionally been romanticized or trivialized in popular culture, portrayed as a kind of bizarre, almost comical, medieval flash mob. But the reality, as you've journeyed through it, was one of profound suffering, fear, and death. It was a public health crisis that baffled contemporary authorities and continues to challenge modern historians. It's a stark reminder of the vulnerability of human societies and individual minds to extraordinary pressures. The dancing plague of 1518 serves as a historical Rorschach test. What you see in it can depend on your disciplinary lens. A neurologist might focus on potential organic brain disorders, a toxicologist on ergot, a sociologist on crowd behavior, a psychologist on conversion disorders, a theologian on spiritual crisis. Its enduring power lies in its refusal to fit neatly into any single box. It forces us to confront the limits of our knowledge and the complex, often unpredictable nature of human experience, especially under duress. The legacy of the dancing plague is not just in history books, it's in the questions it continues to provoke about the interplay between mind, body, and society. How susceptible are we even now to forms of collective behavior driven by stress and suggestion? While we may not see spontaneous dance epidemics in modern cities, though one could argue certain viral internet challenges have a faint, much milder echo, the underlying human psychology that made Strasbourg 1518 possible is still with us. So, as the dust settles on the cobblestone streets of your imagination, as the last faint, ghostly rhythms of that tormented dance fade, you are left with a profound sense of the strange and the unsettling. The peculiar case of the dancing plague of 1518 remains a testament to a time when the world felt less certain, when the boundaries between the known and the unknown were more porous, and when the human spirit, stretched to its limit, could manifest its anguish in the most astonishing and heartbreaking of ways. The Enigma doesn't offer easy answers, only a compelling invitation to keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep wondering about the depths of history and the human condition. The city of Strasbourg moved on, of course. Life continued, but the memory of that summer of frantic, inexplicable movement lingered, a ghostly footnote in its long and storied history, a reminder of a time when the music, if there ever truly was any for the dancers themselves, was one of despair, and the dance itself, a desperate plea for an ending that took far too long to arrive. The shadows in your room seem a little deeper now, the soft hum of the fan a gentle sigh in the stillness. The frantic energy of 16th century Strasbourg has receded, leaving behind only the quiet of your own space, your own time. The unsettling images of endless, involuntary movement, of bodies pushed beyond their limits, can now begin to soften, to blur at the edges as sleep beckons. Remember that the people of 1518, for all the strangeness of their ordeal, were people like us, grappling with fear, seeking understanding, and hoping for relief in a world that often offered little of either. Their story, while peculiar and disturbing, is also a testament to the resilience of communities and the enduring human search for meaning even in the face of the inexplicable. Allow the weight of history to settle, not as a burden, but as a soft blanket. The questions and uncertainties of the dancing plague can rest now, as you prepare to rest. Let the frantic rhythms fade, replaced by the slow, steady beat of your own heart, a quiet anchor in the peaceful darkness. There are no stages here, no desperate pleas to saints, only the gentle invitation to let go, to drift into the calm expanse of your own dreams. The peculiar dance has ended.